Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 27 of the Strokecast. This week, I talk with Nirav H Shah, a neurology hospitalist and medical director at Swedish Medical Center here in Seattle, where I actually went for my own stroke treatment. Nirav has a genuine love for the field, for neurology, and for caring for his patients. You know, it doesn't really come across in the same way in a podcast, but when he starts talking about research and leaps in the field and the potential for significantly improving the quality of life of his patients, his eyes and his face just light up. You can just see the smile as he talks about the potential that we can achieve in the future to take what we learn in research and to make lives so much better. In future episodes, we're going to talk more with Nirav about the latest in research and innovations in stroke care. This week, though, let's focus on getting to know Nirav. Dr. Nirav H. Shah is a fellowship-trained neurologist and subspecialist in cerebrovascular and stroke medicine with board certifications in neurology, stroke medicine, carotid neurosonology, transcranial doppler ultrasound, and neuroimaging. He is a practicing neurohospitalist and stroke medical director at Swedish Medical Center. Academically, he's interested in emergent and critical care neurology research and is an associate editor for the Neurohospitalist, a peer-reviewed journal. He enjoys mentoring trainees and collaborating on publications and conference presentations. Outside of clinical care, Dr. Shah is collaborating with experts to develop scalable technologies capable of ameliorating healthcare's challenges. He consults with startups and investors to develop technologies and devices so that one day they are available to his patients. He has worked with companies to meet FDA regulations for approval, as well as to help them understand the provider perspective on product market fit. Dr. Shah is also the CEO and founder of Sentinel Healthcare. He is a passionate traveler and photographer. So let's meet Nirav.
So welcome to Strokecast, Nirav. I'm thrilled you could join us this week.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we've been having a lot of conversations over the last couple of months about ways that we can sort of work together and talk more about some neurology and some neuroscience stuff. So I look forward to getting started here and talking about some more stuff in future episodes.
Yeah, likewise.
So let's let the listeners get to know you a little bit more. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, certainly. So I am a stroke neurologist here in Seattle at Swedish Medical Center, a large system of care that takes care of over 2,200 stroke patients a year, all the way from Alaska down to the mountains in Washington State. And the way I got here was kind of through a long and curvy path. I got interested in neuroscience in college, where I worked on brain-computer interfaces. And then I went to medical school, got interested in international health, spent time in Central Latin America, thought I would do work abroad, and ultimately decided to go to Miami and do neurology there, which is kind of a mix of both. In Miami, I had some really interesting opportunities to kind of see a lot of undifferentiated patients who didn't have access to care from many backgrounds.
So what does undifferentiated mean?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so people who hadn't been seen before. So undifferentiated meaning they hadn't been seen at all. And so I was the first one to lay hands and eyes on them.
Gotcha.
From a clinical care perspective. And so that was pretty unique because I got to see people who had MS for years maybe, or other rare diseases, and showing up for the first time to our ER in Miami, or get people who got on a plane from Buenos Aires showing up in Miami, stuff like that. So that was very cool, but then I realized we just didn't have all the infrastructure, the technology. So I chose to go to San Francisco to do a fellowship in stroke, where I got interested in how technology can potentially interface with stroke.
And that's really interesting, coming back to what got you into it in college with that whole brain technology interface.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so it kind of came full circle. And here I am in Seattle, where I'm hoping to work on the same interface just as a professional now, kind of as a stroke expert, and then try and interface that with meaningful technology.
Awesome. Well, and Seattle, it seems like it's a fantastic place to do that between the stroke care that's available here, combined with the technology here, and this sort of this epicenter for machine learning and figuring out how all that comes into play.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So what is it about the brain technology interface that really drew your interest back in college?
Well, yeah, and that was back in the early 2000s, and for me, it was an unexplored frontier, right? People talk about space, and beyond that, it was the brain. I mean, we still know so little about it, and so it's very cool to be able to put together software on a human and see if you can kind of interface between the two. That was really exciting to me.
You know, as I've gone through my own recovery, just looking at everything that's happened, it really helps alter the framework that everything the brain is doing. It's just a form of data. It's about sending information to the muscles that no longer respond because that part of the brain isn't paying attention or isn't working anymore. And it really becomes a data problem.
I agree.
In a lot of respects.
I agree.
What's your favorite thing about this field and about working with stroke survivors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if you would have asked me when I started neurology, I would have said stroke is not the thing I would have done. And the reason why I fell in love with it was because it was a great interface of taking care of really sick people who had a big chance for recovery. And so that was the exciting part, is that you could meet someone who's having a stroke in the emergency department and then be involved in their care for the next years to more, and hopefully make a really, really big impact in very small to very big ways from how we took care of them medically and all the bread, butter, medicine ways to the neurological recovery.
And that's one of the really interesting things too when we talk about stroke and probably TBI as well, in some cases, as compared to some of the other neurological conditions, is that it is a sudden onset for folks. You're fine or seemingly fine one day, and then suddenly the next, things don't work the way they used to or the way they're supposed to, as opposed to some other conditions where it happens more gradually.
Exactly.
So it's interesting to have this bigger framework for folks to have a baseline of they more easily retain what their previous normal was.
Yeah, exactly.
So what do you see as the biggest challenge in this field, and the biggest challenges that you work with on a day-to-day basis?
I think from a clinical care delivery perspective, probably the biggest issue I think we're going to face as a society is that there are going to be more people with stroke and more people surviving with stroke. And we haven't figured out a good way of how to take care of all these people. Not everyone can afford rehab. Even people with insurance sometimes get good rehabilitation. And then beyond that, I think we're going to really struggle in trying to determine really meaningful ways to help many people have really good quality of care and good quality of life because of the infrastructure that we just never thought about building. Here we know these 2,200 patients we take care of in Seattle, about 60% of them go home, or to some level of skilled facility for a short period of time, and then many more need more attention. But there's still a lot of good quality of life left that these people could potentially lose, especially if they're not monitored, managed, and taken care of. And frankly, that's what I worry about. It's
interesting. One thing we like to talk about how there is so much more recovery, survival rates improving through everything from TPA to thrombectomies to craniectomies and dealing with hemorrhagic strokes. But what we often don't talk about is that survival is expensive. If somebody survives a stroke, the hospital bill is going to be so much larger than if they didn't. And we as a society have to reckon with that.
Yeah.
What's some of the really interesting research that you're involved with and that you've seen, especially come through Swedish?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we're involved with a number of studies, starting from when a person has their first stroke to all the way to their path out of the hospital in preventing strokes and the second stroke. As you might know, about 8 to 10% of people who've had a stroke go on to have another within the first year. So there's still a lot of room for improvement.
Yay, I made it past the first year.
Good, congratulations. High fives all around. And so it is a big, we've invested in them from a care delivery perspective, and so there's a lot to lose. And so we do everything here from research on thrombectomy. We're involved in many of the major trials. We're involved currently in a trial for neuroprotection. We give a drug to people who are about to undergo thrombectomy to see if this drug changes the rate of recovery. There's a trial called Escape NA1 with our good colleagues in Calgary, Canada. And so that trial may be one of the first trials to demonstrate potential recovery in stroke, which would be huge. Although there have been many other studies of similar neuroprotection that have not borne out. We'll see. So
what's the theory behind that, how that neuroprotection works?
Well, the idea is this molecule somehow stops the inflammation and the damage that's happening and helps promote the recovery.
Okay.
So in a study that's somewhat tragic of macaque monkeys, investigators gave strokes to the macaque monkeys with and without the drug. And by applying the same amount of damage to arteries, the monkeys who got the drug did really well.
Okay.
And the other line of evidence that supports this drug is in patients who've had subarachnoid hemorrhage.
Mm-hmm.
When they received this drug, they were less likely to have delayed cerebral ischemia, a form of stroke.
Right.
And so now we're testing it in a real-world trial, and we're going to find out whether it actually improves recovery. So that's going to be really exciting.
Interesting. So since it works by theoretically preventing inflammation or minimizing inflammation, essentially it sounds like what it's doing is it's basically trying to prevent the brain from swelling, because that swelling and crushing itself against the skull causes more damage.
Correct. Yeah, to some degree, that's correct. Yeah, all the neural inflammation as neurons start to die from lack of oxygen is very dangerous and sends off a domino effect or a cascade of damage. And so as many drugs will probably come out over the next few decades, this is one that targets a part of that inflammation and that toxicity cascade while not hurting the repair process. And so that's a delicate balance.
Right. Interesting. Because I know with my experience and what a lot of other people experience is you have the initial damage, and it's over the next 12 to 24 hours that the impacts continue to cascade. Correct. Through treatment. And something like this can help minimize or end that cascade.
Correct.
So that's some really, really powerful stuff.
Yeah. And there may be other neuroprotectants out there. I wrote an editorial last year that was published in the journal Stroke about a trial called ARTS-2, argatroban treatment in stroke. And that was a study that uses argatroban, which is a drug that directly inhibits thrombin, which is the formation molecule of thrombus. And the thought was from many years ago that...
And thrombus is a clot that forms in place.
Exactly. Thrombus is a clot that forms, and thrombin's part of this cascade that forms clot. But one of the realizations from mice kind of literature is that maybe thrombin is damaging to the neurons as it circulates after the clot's formed. And so this drug does two things. It inhibits thrombin, which means that it can thin the blood. But the secondary effect, the effect that no one's really thought about until these trials, is could it potentially decrease the inflammation from thrombin? So it's been looked at in some mice studies and some other studies. And in this study, which was published last year, ARTS-2, it was a safety study. And the reason why I wrote an editorial was because some of the features of this safety study, this phase 2 study, suggested to me and others that maybe there was a signal of protection. And so in the phase 3, if it gets funded, which we all hope the NIH will pay for, then we'll hopefully design it so that we'll learn whether it's a neuroprotectant or not.
That's really cool. It's one of those things where we talk a lot about what we can do in recovery, but doing what we can to prevent having to do the recovery in the first place.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. And, in some respect, when we look at some of these things as a stroke survivor, I see like when they extended the thrombectomy time in the beginning of the year, my first reaction was, oh, well, now you tell me. Information could have been very useful 7 months ago.
Yeah.
But also with that higher risk of recurrent stroke, obviously helps the general population and those who've already had a stroke. Anything we can do in our next stroke, if it happens, to minimize any further damage becomes even more important since we're already down some brain.
Correct. That's totally correct. I mean, if there was a way to create some suspended animation or protect the brain from hurting itself, that would be ideal. And so many people are working on that. That's really exciting to me. And then beyond that, there's really exciting work on how heart issues can cause stroke to the brain. And so we've done a number of studies and participated in a few in terms of whether strokes that look like they came from the heart could have been protected by blood thinners and a new class of blood thinners called novel oral anticoagulants, or NOACs. So currently we're part of a study called Arcadia, which looks for signs of atriopathy, the atrium and the top chambers of the heart that pump the blood. And we look for features on an EKG, an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound, and some lab markers to see if there's some abnormalities, because we know that we're missing the cause of stroke in about 10% of all people. We call that cryptogenic previously. Now we call it embolic source of undetermined source if we can't identify it, but it looks like an embolic source, meaning an embolus or a clot from somewhere like an artery, like the carotid or the heart.
It's like a clot that forms elsewhere in the body and then floats into the brain and then causes its problems.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of those things frequent travelers especially have to be concerned about for things like deep vein thrombosis that they talk about in the back of the airline magazines.
Exactly. Yeah. And so these types of clots that may go to the brain, maybe we can prevent the next one, even if we can't find the source, even if it's cryptogenic, which means hidden, or it's undetermined, which is the U in ESUS, or like you say, if it's from some other source. The thought is the drugs are now safe enough for blood thinning that maybe we can take that new medication and kind of decrease the risk up front.
Interesting. So does that also then tie into what we've been hearing about AFib and the increased risk of stroke for those who have atrial fibrillation?
Yeah, these drugs exactly are used for atrial fibrillation, but sometimes we don't even know if people are going to have atrial fibrillation. What we also know is that people who've had a stroke, and when we've looked carefully, sometimes don't even have atrial fibrillation. Even if we look for years with a pacemaker or some other loop recorder that's monitoring, that's the learning point for us, is that if it's not just atrial fibrillation, maybe there's something else that's affecting the atria, which is the atrial and atrial fibrillation. Maybe there's something else causing damage and stroke risk there.
Gotcha.
Hence the term atriopathy, pathology or issues with the atria.
Which, of course, gets even worse when there's also a PFO in play.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know you've talked about that before, too.
Yeah.
So we're involved in that as well.
It's fascinating. So many people out there have no idea that 1/3 of the people in the country have a hole in the middle of their heart.
Yeah, that's true. This week, we might be the first time we'll be urgently closing a patent for Valley, a PFO, in a person who has very active clot burden in a stroke. So as that device got approved last year, we're now trying to figure out how to use it more selectively for people who needed it, when 2 years ago it wasn't even an option on the table. So that's pretty exciting.
Right. That is really exciting. And there's a ton of really exciting stuff happening here. And this is really the time as more and more young people are having strokes, Gen X, millennial, and even younger, and folks who are older and are having strokes still have so many more years of vital life ahead of them. Hopefully someday stroke can be had a stroke, you're in the hospital for a couple of days and then you're good. Probably not going to be there anytime soon, but the closer we can get, the better.
That's correct. And I mean, as you and I have talked about before, there's this huge unclear reason for why stroke in the young, i.e. in people who are 40 or less or plus or minus a few years, is increasing across the country. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that. And we know that the work on cholesterol, blood pressure, etc., has been useful in predicting and preventing stroke in elderly people, i.e. 65-year-olds, who are all the average stroke population, but it's not been useful in helping us with younger people.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. It's some very cool stuff. So for somebody who is just now getting into the neurology field, or somebody who's thinking about going down this path or choosing this as their medical specialty, what would you advise them?
Oh, I would advise them to strongly think about it. I mean, there's a lot happening in this field. It's easily one of the fastest changing fields day to day across neurology, not just stroke. Strokes changed 3 times in this decade, got from major guideline changes, which has never happened before. But then even things like headache have changed just last month. There's a new migraine medication that could prevent migraines. It could be the first real new migraine preventative drug, which is exciting.
That is fantastic. You know, friends of mine with migraines, and it's just can be so debilitating.
Yeah. So the face of migraine care has changed just in the past 2 decades. The way we treat epilepsy has changed drastically. The way we treat Parkinson's and MS, multiple sclerosis. All of these fields are changing. Even recently, we're having new evidence as of this year that there's a new treatment potentially for myasthenia gravis that could be a game changer. Myasthenia gravis is a condition that affects the neuron as it connects to the muscle. So there's an autoimmune antibody to the neuron and the muscular junction that's part of some cascade which creates weakness. And so it's very difficult to keep these people able to breathe sometimes, or able to keep their eyes open, or able to swallow. And we have a lot of treatments that we've borrowed from cancer, or borrowed from rheumatology to suppress the immune system, but overall they're very generic immunosuppressive drugs. And this new drug is an antibody to a cascade called complement, may be very useful in preventing the consequences of myasthenia gravis. So it's a lot of work to be done. And so every day we're learning something new. And so this is going to be a very interesting field. So if you want to have something to read for the rest of your life, get into neurology.
Get into neurology, exactly.
There's going to be a lot to be done.
And in your work with patients, you encounter folks who are suddenly entering this world for the first time and very unwillingly. You know, so what do you wish that more stroke survivors and caregivers knew early on in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I wish they would understand that there's still the potential for really great quality of life. I think there's so much fear in people's minds. It's known as a top killer. And while that's true, those numbers are going down. The consequences of the morbidity are going down. And so when I interact with people and their families the first time, sometimes their understanding and perception of how dangerous this is not totally accurate. And then other times it is accurate, which would be nice so that we can try and work together to find out whether this is maybe the end of someone's life, for better or worse, and whether we can make that one that's dignified and pain-free. And so there are 2 kind of sides of that coin, and obviously a big spectrum in between that is a big part of what we spend our time doing, which is a real joy of mine. It makes it really fulfilling.
Well, this has been fantastic. If folks want to know more about the work you're doing or what you're up to, where should they go?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me there. Nirav H Shah on LinkedIn at Swedish. And yeah, stay in touch. Happy to connect with people and talk about the future of stroke together.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And we'll look forward to talking to you again in a few weeks about some of the other new, cool, and exciting trends happening in neuroscience.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you.
You know, it's great to hear about all the updates in the stroke recovery field. What would you like to hear more about in future discussions? What new innovations in research are you thinking about a lot these days that you've heard about in the news or in other places and wonder just How do they work and are they real? Let us know in the comments over at strokecast.com/Nirav, and we may ask him on a future episode. Do you know someone else that likes brains and finds them fascinating? Go ahead and send them a link to this episode. Just send them to strokecast.com/Nirav. Be sure to subscribe to Strokecast in your favorite podcast application so you never miss an episode. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.